Thank you, Father Mark. Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here and talk to you. Unfortunately, I've never met Bishop Sipovich, the great man, when he passed away in London. I was in primary school on the other side of the island, separated from this beautiful island by thousands of Soviet tanks. But his presence still felt everywhere in London, because he was the key person who established our community in Finchley, which still exists. It's a vibrant community, and we have sort of people, young people sort of coming and joining us all the time. So the community, as Father Mark mentioned, it's now got a beautiful church. It was constructed in 2016. It replaced a small chapel which existed, within Marian House. And also Bishop Sipovich was a sort of key person to establish a library. So the largest Belarusian library outside Belarus exists in London. So it served its purpose during the sort of communist times when researchers couldn't go easily to the Soviet Union, and now with political problems in Belarus again, it's very popular when people can find about Belarus without sort of risking life. Mr. Lukashenko there. But maybe I'll say sort of a few words about Belarus and then Bishop Sipovich. So I'll be brief. I'll start with the Ice Age. So that's sort of the ice was sort of coming and retreating. Different people sort of settled in what is now Belarus. Until the Slavs came in between the 6th and the 8th century. That's what it's estimated. And they sort of established their farmsteads. Now Belarus, like Ukraine, it sort of sits on the waterways between the Baltic Sea and Constantinople, and hence it sort of attracted the attention of the Vikings at the time. And hence, the idea of the Kievan Rus, essentially, sort of the Vikings coming and establishing states there, so they get sort of free trade with Constantinople, going through the rivers, via sort of Belarus and Ukraine, on Boristan, which is now sort of called Dnipro or Dnieper. So the Belarusian various principalities existed in Belarus, and some of them were part of the Kievan Rus state. Some of them were sort of paying tribute to it, and so on and so forth. So then the Mongols sort of come, and Belarusian lands, joined the Great Duchy of Lithuania, which was sort of becoming a powerful state independent from the Mongols. And hence some people say Belarus means sort of this white Rus, which sort of wasn't affected by the Mongols, and it's sort of white as opposed to sort of non-white. So sort of black force from the east, sort of dark force, so to speak. Yeah, so that's sort of one of the sort of the theories behind it. But I would say a lot of it sort of shrouded in sort of mythology and mystery. There are very few documents, and they're not sort of entirely reliable about the sort of history of those ages. But anyway, so Belarus becomes part of the Great Duchy of Lithuania for the next 5 centuries, and as well as the Ukrainian lands, and really sort of Belarusian lands and Ukrainian separated from Ukraine, became part of the Polish kingdom, and Lithuania sort of had a dynastic union with Poland. So the Ukrainian lands, they sort of joined the kingdom of Poland, whereas Belarus stayed with the Great Duchy of Lithuania. That's how the sort of final separation happened between the Ruthenian people, what is now sort of Belarus and Ukraine, and that's when the language is separated. So some people say that until the time, Belarus and Ukraine were pretty much like dialects of the same Ruthenian language, but with that political separation, they got finally separated. Whereas the Russian lands were under the Mongols until they Moscow became powerful and they managed to shake off the Mongols and amalgamate Russian lands. So the next watershed moment was sort of the fall of Constantinople, because until then, Belarus and Ukraine, the Orthodox people, there's subordinated patriarch there. So the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, Moscow assumes the role of the third Rome, and then sort of becoming dominant figure, saying the center of Orthodoxy there. At the same time, there are various attempts to unite the church, and finally the successful one was the Brest Union. So Brest is a city in western Belarus, so which created the Union Church in 1596. So interestingly, these days the Ukrainian Union Church is much more powerful than the Belarusian one in numerical, but at the time Belarusians were much keener than Ukrainians on this idea. So actually the main opposition came from the Ukrainians who wanted to stay as Orthodox, whereas the Belarusians kind of said that sounds interesting. So the rest of over the century, the Union Church in Ukraine became the main sort of perhaps one of the key forces behind the new sort of Ukrainian national idea, and hence it's much more powerful church there. But anyway, the Union Church comes, and a few some decades later, about 80% of Belarusians become unions, and people sort of debate from a political perspective whether it's entirely voluntary or whether it's a bit of pressure was exerted. Anyway, so then what the Russian Empire sort of takes Belarus, which was sort of actually much later than Eastern Ukraine. So for the Eastern Ukraine, allowed the Russian a lot sooner than Belarus, although sort of Western Ukraine, very western, they stayed under the Austrians. But anyway, so when Belarus became part of the Russian Empire at the end of the 18th century, and initially, they sort of tolerated the Union Church, although there were sort of various attempts to move people across. But then after several uprisings against Russian rules, they had enough is enough, and in the early 19th century they banned the Union Church and forcefully sort of moved people across. So there's no debate there. So there's no voluntary at that point of time. So the church was just banned. And the Bishop Sipovich, I'll come to that, became the first Union bishop in Belarus in 150 years, because there was this significant historic break between the ban on the Union Church in Belarus and when the last bishop and Bishop Sipovich, who became bishop in 1960. So Belarus stays under Russia, but then at the end of for a century and a half, and then obviously towards the end of the 19th century, there's national ideas around Eastern Europe and their national myth and so on and so forth. When everyone wants to be a nation, and then sort of World War I comes, the Russian Empire disintegrates, and everyone declares independence, including Ukraine and Belarus. So the independent Belarusian Republic didn't exist very long because the Soviets sort of came and overran it and established an alternative Soviet Republic, which then sort of became part of the Soviet Union. And that's when Bishop Sipovich was born. So Bishop Sipovich was born a few months after the beginning of World War I, essentially. So he was born in the autumn of 1914. So at the time it was still the Russian Empire, although it lasted about 3 years. And then after World War I, so Belarus was sort of fought over firstly between the Soviets and the Germans, and then sort of Trotsky sort of ceded half of Belarus to the Germans, but then Germans were after the German troubles, they were kicked out, and when Poles came, so the Poles tried to create, they sort of all the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and sort of fought with the Soviets, but then the Polish, sort of a different idea in Poland prevailed, the sort of national democratic idea that Poland was for Poles, rather than the sort of idea of federation of multiple people. So they said, okay, let's just sort of limit ourselves to territories where we can sort of claim Polish, and but anyway, they managed to sort of take Western Belarus and Western Ukraine as well. So western parts of Belarus and Ukraine in the interwar period were part of Poland. And that's where sort of Bishop Sipovich grew up. So he was a Belarusian living in Poland, which was not entirely happy place, he said, because of that idea of Poland for Poles, so being national minorities. And that, obviously it was much nicer than being in the Soviet Union, particularly sort of liberal or democratic place of national minorities. So the Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jewish people at the time. So anyway, his origin is Roman Catholic, so he decided early on that he wants to become a Catholic priest, and he trained as such. But then, just before World War II, he becomes an Eastern Rite priest, and that's because there was a drive by the Vatican to sort of train Belarusian priests to convert Russia. So a lot of them were sort of encouraged to go to China of all places, because in northern China and Caribbean there was an amalgamation of those Russian refugees, after the revolution, and so there was the idea in the Vatican that the Belarusians were best people to convert Russians, and they said, okay, let's just send them there. And so a lot of Belarusian priests went to Caribbean, including and that's what sort of Bishop Sipovich was supposed to do. But he goes to the Vatican to train in the Eastern Rite, and obviously sort of World War I comes, and that idea of sort of converting Russia was being sort of forgotten, and so Bishop Sipovich stays in Vatican during the war, and after the war he comes to London. That's because in London estimated 10,000 Belarusians arrived to London after World War II. The many people from Western Belarus with Polish passports from sort of church allowed to stay here. I think there was a deal between church and Stalin that Soviet citizens would go back and Polish citizens before the war stay in Britain. So that's why nearly everyone nearly all Belarusians were from that part of Belarus, which was about Poland before the war. So they were allowed to stay in Britain, and Bishop Sipovich was sent here to search their spiritual needs. So he comes here and being a sort of great man, with a vision, he starts establishing those centers. He cared a lot about Eastern Christianity, and he cared a lot about Belarusian culture. These were sort of two of his main efforts. So in the cultural space, he launches, the annual Belarusian Society in the early 50s, which was intended to promote, Belarusian culture and history among English-speaking people. So he puts a lot of effort into that project. And equally, with Eastern Christianity, he revives the Society of John Chrysostom, which I believe had been established before World War II, but then declined, and Bishop Sipovich revived it with some help, I believe, in the 1950s as well. So the way to look at him are those two strands. But he was, I understand, a very ambitious individual with a vision. As Father Natson was saying, if he wasn't a priest, he'd probably be a successful businessman or whatever, because he could certainly, he had the vision which he was able to implement. That was the same as the library. So he was a book collector who, with some other priests in Finchley, collected so many books that the ceiling collapsed. So they said in 1969 he was time to buy a separate house. So they raised an astronomical amount of £12,000 and bought a house in a dedicated house for the library, which, as I mentioned, still exists. And so the Bishop Sipovich passed this collection there. So regretfully, he passed away relatively young. I believe he was 67 when he died in 1981. So I wish we would sort of survive for another sort of 10-15 years, so I could make him pass. So that's I think it's the way to look at it. But I believe that some people the options not to look at it. Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I just wondered, as a question about the spiritual life of the Belarusian Greek Catholic Church, and which saints and which icons and what is important to
Yeah, I think the key saints would be Skaryna Library and Cyril of Turau. Because again, to some extent, it's kind of linked to those national myths in the 19th century, and obviously sort of people looked at saints, within their sort of territorial domain, and there are two main principalities, the Principality of Polotsk and the Principality of Turau in those sort of ancient times. And so Saint Skaryna hails from Polotsk, and Cyril of Turau was a saint, I believe, in the 12th century, from Turau. So on that basis, that they sort of hail from the Belarusian land, and what is now Belarusian lands, as to the main saints. I mean, obviously, before in those times when like our icon, there was a single pattern in Kiev, and obviously the Belarusians would have venerated the icon the same way as everyone else, although sort of is an Eastern right hand at the time. Essentially, it was the single patriarch. So I'm sure that there was a lot of sort of veneration of this particular icon. But these days, people sort of tend to look at their, if you want, own sort of saints, just purely from a territorial, I guess, perspective.
Paul, thank you very, very much, and please return with our warm greetings to Father Sipovich. It was wonderful. Thank you. So it was very significant that Bishop Sipovich was invited to dedicate this icon from the immense and ancient spiritual patrimony of Belarus, its aspirations for freedom, but also the aspiration for the restoration of unity between the East and West, Catholic unity. I'd also like to ask Deacon Basil, who is a stalwart of this parish, but also an immense help to our new English language mission in the Ukrainian Cathedral Parish down in Halsbury Road at Sacred Heart Church, dedicated to St Theodore of Canterbury. Deacon Basil knew Bishop Sipovich personally.
It's a sobering reminder of Anno Domini when you read obituaries of the Daily Telegraph and realise you actually knew the person about whom you're reading. And it's likewise a sobering reminder of how old I'm getting when I'm asked to give a few words about someone I actually met, whom no one else possibly here has met. There's an intriguing little piece in our guidebook to this church, which maybe not everyone has read, but I'll just read to you. It relates to this icon. On Sunday, the 15th of June 1963, Bishop Sipovich, the White Russian bishop in London, was invited to bless an icon of the Vladimir Madonna, presented to Warwick Street Church and placed on the wall beside the sanctuary. It was the first time the bishop said that he had been invited to bless an icon in London. In addition, he was asked to bless the lady altar recently reconstructed. He spoke of the traditional devotion of the Russian people to Our Lady. Intriguing little entry, which I imagine most people have forgotten about, but I hadn't. So when I read that, I made some inquiries upstairs with the boss, at least the boss's, not the boss's boss, about where it was now. And it was found in the dining room. And so we perhaps thought we might reinstall the icon, already blessed of course, and sanctified in the church. The reason I met Bishop Sipovich in the first place was that a friend and I were asked to write some articles on the Eastern Catholic churches for the Bronze Oratory Parish magazine. And so we trotted over to Woodside Park to see Bishop Sipovich for the first one about Byzantine Catholicism, specifically in Belarus. And well, he entertained us very well. He was a great raconteur, Bishop Sipovich, and also a magnificent chess player, as I later discovered. I never beat him once. He was very informative. I'd had a wide interest in the Eastern churches for some time before that, which is presumably why we were asked to write the articles. And so I already shared a certain amount of background knowledge with him. His liturgical knowledge was immense. One thing that our friend perhaps didn't mention is the Niconian reforms in the Russian Orthodox Church didn't actually reach that far out in the Russian Empire. So the old rite was still widely used in Belarus. Bishop Sipovich was in the process at that time of compiling with Father Nansen an edition of the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which was later published, which adhered to the old rite. I'm sure we've got copies in the library still. But Bishop Sipovich came to London, as was already said, in 1947, largely to look after displaced persons, Belarusians who were actually in the Polish army. There was a very large number of people in the men in the Polish army who were not ethnically Polish, but they joined up and were here. Indeed, the Orthodox Poles, inverted commas, even had their own bishop, Bishop Matthew. Some of his vestments are now in my possession. So he looked after the Orthodox in that jurisdiction. There's also interesting to remember also that for a time, 5 years I think, Bishop Sipovich also served as a superior of the Congregation of Marian House, which is a religious order, sort of missionary order, but they did run parishes, who ironically were largely Latin and Polish, but he was the superior of that congregation for some years. Now I think some bishops, particularly perhaps the ordinary of the ordinary Our Lady of Walsingham, probably feel their brief is very wide. They have to do a lot of travelling from the West Country right up to Scotland. But Bishop Sipovich's brief was about as wide as you can get, because he was apostolic visitor for the Belarusian faithful in the entire world, which you can't get a bigger brief than that. And so it meant that he was often in South America, often in Australia, often in Europe. Of course, the one place he couldn't be was Belarus at that time, of course. But he was often, I don't know whether they had air miles in the 70s, I can't remember, but if they did, he would have earned a great many, because he was very widely travelled, and he looked after the Belarusian faithful all over the world, and they are quite widely dispersed, as we learned when we met him. I subsequently got involved in the Society of St. John Chrysostom, which at that time he was in the process of reviving, together with the formidable Heli Georgiadis, who was a Greek lady Orthodox who converted actually to Catholicism. And she and he together were instrumental in organising an annual liturgy for the Society of St. John Chrysostom, largely in English, which was celebrated in quite a number of London churches. I suspect possibly this one at one point, but certainly Westminster Cathedral. And with the encouragement of Bishop Sipovich, Dom Placid Noak of Cockfosters, which was then an Olivetti Benedictine house, no longer, organised, well, I was going to say a scratch choir, but actually it was really more than a scratch choir, because they used to rehearse quite a lot. And Dom Placid was a great musician, and he put together a choir that could sing in Church Slavonic, Greek and English. And they used to turn out for this liturgy and for other events during the year. And I attended quite a few of those. And I occasionally served at the liturgy in the tiny little chapel that is in Marian House. At the time it was the only place of worship, really. But very cosy and a place of deep piety. So I used to serve the liturgy there, which was at that time still celebrated largely in Church Slavonic, which I can understand, rather than in the vernacular as it is now. But he was, as I said, a great raconteur, a man of immense charm, and he would listen to people. He was a great pastor, as well as being a great administrator. I'm sure he would be a very successful businessman, or anything else he would turn his attention to. But his interaction, I think, with his fellow Christians, both Latins and other churches, Anglicans and Nonconformists, made him a widely respected figure. And I'm sure that those few people left who do remember him are very fond of him. So when we venerate this icon today, perhaps we might also remember him and grant his repose to his soul. Thank you.